You're replaceable. The words didn't echo. They landed, sharp and clean, like something rehearsed too many times to feel anymore. Emily Carter didn't flinch, not outwardly. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting that flat corporate glow over rows of identical desks, identical screens, identical people who all suddenly looked very interested in not looking at her. She stood there, a thin folder still in her hands, her knuckles pale against the cheap cardstock, her heartbeat loud enough she wondered if anyone else could hear it. 3 feet away, behind a polished glass desk that probably cost more than her entire year's rent, stood Alexander Hayes, tailored suit, watch that caught the light just enough to remind everyone in the room who he was without him ever needing to say it. His expression was calm, almost bored, like this was just another Tuesday decision, another name on a list. Replaceable. Emily let the word settle, let it burn just long enough to make sure she'd remember it later. Then she lifted her chin slightly, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. Then replace me. A murmur rippled somewhere behind her, quickly swallowed. No one spoke up. No one ever did. Alexander's eyes flickered, just for a second. Not anger. Not even surprise. Something else. Something sharper. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that same controlled neutrality. Emily exhaled slowly, placed the folder down on the edge of his desk with deliberate care, then reached for the lanyard around her neck. The plastic badge, her name, her ID number, her entire place in this building reduced to a barcode, felt heavier than it should have. She slipped it off, set it beside the folder, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The office seemed to hold its breath. This was it. No dramatic speech. No begging. Just a quiet exit. She turned. One step, then another, each one lighter than the last, like she was shedding something she hadn't realized was weighing her down. But before she could reach the glass doors, before she could disappear back into the city that didn't care whether she had a job or not, a hand closed gently, but firmly, around her wrist. Not rough, not forceful, just enough to stop her. Emily froze. The contact sent a small, unexpected jolt through her, not fear, something closer to confusion. Slowly, she turned back. Alexander stood closer now, close enough she could see the faint crease between his brows, the detail of his eyes, blue, but not cold like she'd assumed. Focused, searching. His voice dropped, quieter than before, meant only for her, cutting through the hum of the office like it didn't belong to the same man who'd dismissed her seconds ago. You're not leaving here. The words weren't a command. They weren't loud, but they carried weight, something unspoken, something that didn't fit into performance reviews or corporate hierarchy. Emily's breath caught, just slightly, her gaze locking with his, trying to read what had just changed and why. Around them, the office slowly resumed its motion, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, as if nothing had happened at all. But something had, and for the first time since she'd walked into this building months ago, Emily Carter realized this wasn't just about a job anymore. Emily did not pull her hand away right away, not because she was unsure, but because something in the way he held her made it clear this was not about control. It was about interruption, like he had stepped in front of a moving train he did not fully understand yet. She slowly lowered her gaze to his hand around her wrist, then back up to his face, her voice calm, but edged with something firmer now, something earned. You just told me I am replaceable. Alexander did not release her immediately, but his grip loosened, enough to make it clear she could walk away if she wanted to. That is what this company teaches, he replied quietly, his tone measured, but there was a crack in it now, something less rehearsed, something real. Emily let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. No, she said, shaking her head slightly. That is what people like you say when it is easier than actually seeing someone. The words landed differently than before. Not loud, not confrontational, just honest. For a second, Alexander said nothing. His eyes studied her like he was trying to solve something that did not fit into numbers or reports or performance metrics. Around them, the office noise blurred into a distant hum, like they were standing in a space carved out just for this moment. Emily gently pulled her wrist free, and this time, he let her. She reached for her badge. On the desk again, not to put it back on, but to pick it up, turning it over between her fingers, staring at the printed name like it belonged to someone else. This, she said softly, holding it up, This is what is replaceable. The ID. The number. The role. Not me. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. She set the badge back down, firmer this time, like closing a chapter. I stayed late. I covered shifts no one else wanted. I fixed problems that were not mine because someone had to. And today, you did not even ask what actually happened. You just decided I was the easiest piece to remove. There was no accusation in her tone, just facts. That made it worse. Alexander exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the folder she had placed on his desk, then back to her. You broke protocol, he said, but the words sounded weaker now, like they no longer carried the weight they were supposed to. Emily met his eyes without hesitation. I fixed a mistake that would have cost the company $200,000 because someone else was too afraid to admit they made it. A pause. Just long enough. If that is breaking protocol, then maybe your system is the problem. Silence stretched between them, thicker this time. Not uncomfortable. Heavy. Real. Somewhere in the distance, a phone rang. Then another, life continuing as if this moment did not exist. But for Alexander, it did. He looked at her differently now, not as an employee standing in front of his desk, but as something that did not fit into the neat structure he had spent years building. You think I did not see that? He asked quietly. Emily's brow furrowed, just slightly. That was not the response she expected. Then why say it? She asked. And for the first time since this began, Alexander did not answer immediately. He held her gaze, something shifting behind his eyes, something calculating but not cold, something personal. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, like he had made a decision she did not yet understand. Because I needed to see what you would do next. The words hung there, suspended between them, changing everything without explaining anything. Emily blinked, confusion flickering across her face, quickly replaced by something sharper. I am not part of your test, she said, her tone tightening. I am a person. Alexander nodded once, slow, deliberate. Exactly. And somehow, that made even less sense than before. Emily stared at him, the word exactly echoing in her mind like a piece that did not fit into any version of reality she understood, and for a moment she almost thought she had misheard him, but his expression did not change. It held steady, calm in a way that made it even more unsettling because it suggested intention, not impulse. You needed to see what I would do, she repeated slowly, her voice quieter now, but sharper, as if each word was being weighed before it left her lips. So you humiliated me in front of the entire floor? Alexander did not react defensively, did not raise his voice, did not step back, and somehow that made the space between them feel even tighter. I created pressure, he said, his tone precise, almost clinical, but there was something underneath it now, something less detached. Pressure reveals what performance hides. Emily let out a breath, her shoulders tightening as she processed that, her grip on her own composure the only thing keeping her from walking out without another word. I am not a lab experiment, she said, her eyes locking onto his, refusing to let him turn this into something abstract. I am someone who needed this job to pay rent, to keep the lights on, to make sure my brother can stay in school. That pressure you created? That is not theoretical for me. For the first time, something in Alexander's posture shifted, subtle but real, like a detail most people would miss but impossible to ignore once seen. He had expected resistance, but not this kind of clarity, not this kind of truth delivered without fear. And yet you still chose to protect someone else, he said quietly. Emily blinked, caught off guard again, frustration flickering across her face. Because it was the right thing to do, she answered immediately, as if the answer required no thought at all. Not because I was hoping you would notice. Not because I thought it would help me. I did it because someone had to. The words hung there, heavier than anything else that had been said so far. Alexander's gaze did not leave her, but something behind it changed again, something less analytical. And more certain. That is exactly why I noticed, he said. Emily shook her head, taking a small step back now, creating space where she could think clearly again. Then you have a strange way of showing it, she replied, her voice steadier now, grounded again in her decision. She glanced briefly at the glass doors, at the world outside that did not know her name, but also did not try to define it, then back at him. You said I am replaceable. Maybe in your system, that is true. But I am not going to stay somewhere that only sees me as a line item on a spreadsheet. Alexander followed her gaze for a moment, then returned to her, his expression no longer unreadable but focused in a different way, like he was no longer observing her, but aligning with something she had said. "If I only saw you as a number, you would already be gone," he said. Emily hesitated, just slightly, because there was no arrogance in the statement, no attempt to impress, just a simple fact delivered without decoration. That made it harder to dismiss. "Then what is this?" she asked, gesturing lightly between them. The tension, the contradiction, the confusion that had built in just a few minutes. Alexander took a slow breath, his voice lowering again, not for secrecy, but because the moment demanded it. "This," he said, "is me deciding whether to change the system or let it continue the way it always has." Emily searched his face, trying to find the line between sincerity and strategy, between truth and manipulation, and for the first time, she could not immediately tell which side he stood on. That uncertainty should have pushed her away. Instead, it held her there, just long enough for doubt to slip into her certainty. Emily did not answer right away, and that silence stretched long enough to feel intentional, like she was testing him now, measuring whether his words carried weight or were just another layer of control dressed up as reflection, and for a moment the entire office seemed to fall away again, leaving only the quiet tension between them and the faint hum of fluorescent lights above. She looked down at the badge still resting on the edge of his desk, then back at him, her expression no longer defensive, but cautious, like someone standing at the edge of something unknown. "You do not get to decide that for me," she said finally, her voice calm but grounded, steady in a way that came from knowing exactly what she was risking. "If something changes, it is because I choose to stay, not because you decide I am worth keeping." Alexander nodded once, slowly, as if that was the answer he had been waiting for, not resisting it, not correcting it, just accepting it as fact. "Then choose," he said, his tone quieter now, but firmer, stripped of the earlier authority and replaced with something closer to invitation. That shift alone made Emily hesitate again, because it was not what she expected, not what she had prepared herself to walk away from. She studied him carefully, searching for the angle, the strategy, the reason behind this sudden change in tone, but instead she found something else, something she could not easily define, something that did not match the man who had just called her replaceable minutes ago. "Why me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it, not as a challenge, but as something more honest, more vulnerable than she intended to show. Alexander did not look away this time. "Because you did not negotiate your values," he answered without hesitation. "Everyone else in that room adjusted themselves to fit the system. You did not, even when it cost you something." Emily's jaw tightened slightly, because hearing it said out loud made it real in a way she had not allowed herself to acknowledge before. She had not thought of it as strength. She had thought of it as survival. "That is not strength," she said quietly. "That is just not having anything left to compromise." Alexander shook his head, just once. "That is exactly what strength looks like when it is not performative," he replied. The words settled between them, heavier than any argument, because they reframed everything she thought she understood about what had just happened. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emily glanced toward the floor again, toward the open office where people were now pretending to work, but clearly still listening, still watching from the corners of their eyes, and something in her expression shifted, not softer, but more resolved. "Even if I stay," she said slowly, "nothing changes if the people making decisions still think like that." She nodded slightly toward the room, toward the invisible structure that had allowed this moment to happen in the first place. Alexander followed her gaze, then looked back at her, and this time there was no hesitation at all in his response. Then maybe they should not be the ones making decisions anymore. The statement was simple, but it carried a weight that did not belong to a mid-level manager, not to someone who was supposed to operate within the system, not redefine it. Emily caught that immediately, her eyes narrowing just slightly as a new question formed, one she had not considered before. "You talk like you can change all of it," she said, her tone shifting again, more observant now, more careful. Alexander held her gaze, and for the first time since this began, there was something unmistakable in his expression, something that hinted at a larger truth just beneath the surface, something that had been there the entire time but had not yet been revealed. "I can," he said simply. And this time, it did not sound like confidence. It sounded like certainty. Emily held his gaze, and for a second, the entire world seemed to narrow into that one sentence, that one certainty that did not belong to the version of him she had been given so far, and something inside her shifted, not trust, not yet, but awareness, like she had just stepped onto ground that was not what it seemed. You can, she repeated quietly, her voice no longer challenging, but probing, trying to understand what he was not saying. Alexander did not elaborate, did not rush to explain, and that restraint itself felt deliberate, like he was waiting for her to reach the conclusion on her own rather than forcing it into the open. Emily glanced past him again, at the rows of desks, the managers, the supervisors, the structure that had always felt immovable, and then back at him, her eyes narrowing slightly as pieces began to fall into place. You are not just a department head, are you? She said, not quite a question, more like a realization forming in real time. A faint shift in Alexander's expression followed, not denial, not confirmation, just a quiet acknowledgement that she was getting closer. The silence stretched just long enough to confirm what words had not yet said. Emily's breath caught slightly, and she straightened, instinctively creating distance again, not physical this time, but mental, recalibrating everything she thought she understood about this moment. So this was never about protocol, she continued, her tone sharpening again, but now layered with something new, something closer to disbelief. This was about you watching how people react when they think no one important is paying attention. Alexander's lips pressed into a thin line, not defensive, but thoughtful, as if he respected the way she had pieced it together. People behave differently when they believe there are no consequences, he said. That is when you see what is real. Emily let out a slow breath, shaking her head slightly, her frustration returning, but this time it was more focused. And what about me? She asked, her voice steady again. Was I just part of your observation? Alexander stepped slightly closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to make it clear he was no longer speaking from a distance. You were the only one who did not behave differently, he answered. That is why this conversation exists at all. The words landed heavier than anything else he had said, because they carried intention, not convenience. Emily looked at him, really looked this time, past the suit, past the title she had assumed, trying to reconcile the man who had dismissed her with the one standing in front of her now. You put me in a position where I could lose everything, she said, her voice quieter now, not accusing, but grounded in truth. And you are telling me that was necessary. Alexander did not look away. I am telling you that what you did in that moment cannot be trained, cannot be instructed, and cannot be replaced, he replied. The word replace hung between them again, but this time it did not sound the same. It no longer felt like a dismissal. It felt like a correction. Emily's fingers curled slightly at her sides, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction as she processed that, but the conflict did not disappear. You still have not answered the only question that matters, she said after a moment. Alexander waited. Am I still fired? She asked. There was no fear in the question, just clarity. Alexander glanced briefly at the badge still resting on the desk, then back at her, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, certain, and final in a way that shifted the entire weight of the moment. No, he said. You were never fired. The words settled into the space between them, changing everything again, but this time, instead of confusion, Emily felt something else begin to rise, something cautious, something reluctant, but undeniably present, the first fragile edge of possibility. Emily did not react immediately, and that pause said more than any response could have, because the words "you were never fired" did not erase what she had just felt, did not undo the weight of standing in front of an entire office believing everything she depended on had just been taken away. She let out a slow breath, her gaze dropping briefly to the badge on the desk before lifting back to him, steadier now, but no longer uncertain. Then what exactly was that? She asked, her voice calm, but no longer soft, no longer willing to accept half answers. Because it felt real. Alexander did not dismiss that. He nodded slightly, acknowledging it without trying to soften it. It was real, he said. The pressure, the consequences, the choice you had to make. That part was not staged. Emily crossed her arms loosely, not defensive, but grounded, holding her space now instead of reacting to his. "So you created a situation where I believed I could lose everything, just to prove a point," she said. Alexander's expression tightened, not in disagreement, but in recognition of the cost of that decision. "I created a situation where the truth could not be hidden behind performance," he replied. "And you proved something most people never do when it actually matters." Emily shook her head slightly, a quiet exhale escaping her as she processed that, her thoughts moving faster now, connecting pieces she had not even realized were there. "You keep saying that like it justifies it," she said. "Like the result makes the method acceptable." Alexander did not interrupt. He let her speak, let her hold the ground she had earned. "You do not get to decide what someone risks just because you want to see who they are," she continued, her voice still even, but carrying more weight now. "You do not know what they are holding together outside of this building." That landed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. For the first time since this conversation began, Alexander did not have an immediate answer. His gaze held hers, but something shifted again, something quieter, something more reflective than controlled. "You are right," he said after a moment, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to reframe it. Just acceptance. Emily blinked, slightly caught off guard, because she had expected resistance, not agreement. That threw her off balance more than any argument could have. "Then why do it again?" she asked, her tone softer now, not because she trusted him, but because she was trying to understand him. Alexander took a slow breath, his eyes briefly flicking toward the office floor, toward the people who were still pretending not to listen, then back to her. "Because if no one challenges it, it continues," he said. "And people like you either learn to compromise who they are, or they leave." Emily's jaw tightened slightly at that, because she knew he was not wrong, and that made it harder to dismiss everything else he had said. She glanced down again at the badge, then at her empty hands, then back at him. "And what happens now?" she asked, her voice steady again, the question no longer about the past, but about what came next. Alexander stepped back just slightly, creating space this time, not taking it, but giving it. "Now," he said, "you decide if this is still a place you want to stand in." The choice hung between them, clear, unforced, and for the first time since she had walked into that office, Emily realized she was no longer reacting to the system. She was deciding whether to be part of it at all. Emily did not answer right away, and this time the silence felt different, not heavy with confusion, but deliberate, like she was standing at the edge of a decision that would shape more than just the next few minutes. Her eyes moved once more across the office, across the people who had watched her almost lose everything without saying a word, across the system that had made that moment possible, and then back to Alexander, who now stood not as someone blocking her path, but as someone waiting to see which direction she would choose. She let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing slightly as the tension that had carried her through the confrontation began to settle into something steadier, something more controlled. "If I stay," she said finally, her voice calm, measured, "it is not because of you." Alexander did not react defensively, did not interrupt, just nodded once, acknowledging the boundary she was setting. "It is because I am not finished yet," she continued, her gaze holding his, unwavering now. "And I am not going to walk away just because the system is flawed. I would rather see if it can actually change." A faint shift crossed Alexander's expression, not surprise, but something closer to recognition, like this was exactly the answer he had expected, and yet still respected hearing it said out loud. "Then stay," he said quietly. "Not for me. Not for the company. Stay for that reason." Emily studied him for a moment longer, as if confirming that there was no hidden condition attached to those words, no unspoken expectation waiting to surface later. When she found none, she turned back toward the desk, reaching for the badge again, but this time her hand paused just above it. The small piece of plastic looked the same as it had minutes ago, but it did not feel the same anymore. It was no longer something that defined her place. It was something she could choose to wear or not. Slowly, she picked it up, her fingers closing around it with quiet certainty. She did not put it on right away. Instead, she held it for a second, then slipped it back over her neck, not as an act of submission, but as a decision. Behind her, the office had gone unusually quiet, the kind of silence that only happens when people are pretending not to listen but missing nothing. Emily could feel it, the attention, the curiosity, the unspoken questions hanging in the air, but for the first time, it did not weigh on her. She turned slightly, just enough to face the room, her posture straight, her expression composed, and without raising her voice, she spoke clearly enough for those closest to hear. "We are going to review the project errors from this morning," she said, her tone professional, steady, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if she had always been in control of this moment. A few heads lifted. A few people exchanged quick glances. No one challenged her. Alexander watched her, silent, as she stepped away from his desk and moved back into the space she had almost walked away from. But this time, her presence felt different. Not smaller, not cautious, defined. He did not follow her immediately. He remained where he was for a moment, observing, but not as a test anymore, as confirmation. Then, without drawing attention, he turned slightly toward one of the senior managers standing nearby, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a weight that did not need volume to be understood. "We will be reviewing leadership decisions across this department," he said. The manager stiffened almost instantly. Starting today, there was no announcement, no spectacle, just a quiet shift that began to ripple outward, subtle but undeniable. And across the room, Emily Carter, with a badge that no longer defined her, stepped into a system that had just started to change, whether it was ready or not. The shift did not happen loudly, and that was what made it impossible to ignore. By mid-morning, the usual rhythm of the office had returned on the surface, keyboards tapping, phones ringing, quiet conversations tucked between cubicle walls, but underneath it, something had changed, something subtle but steady, like a current running just beneath still water. Emily sat at her desk, the glow of her monitor reflecting faintly in her eyes, her posture straight, focused, but not tense, not like before. The project files were open in front of her, numbers, timelines, reports, all the pieces that had been used against her only an hour earlier, now laid out clearly, stripped of distortion. She moved through them with precision, not rushing, not proving anything, just working the way she always had, except now there was no hesitation in her decisions. Around her, a few coworkers glanced over more often than usual, their curiosity no longer hidden, their silence less certain than before. No one interrupted her. No one questioned her. That alone said enough. Across the floor, one of the senior managers, Daniel Reeves, stood near the glass conference room, speaking in low tones to another supervisor, his posture tight, his usual confidence replaced with something less comfortable, something edged with caution. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked toward Emily, then away again, like he was recalculating something he had already assumed was settled. He had been the one who pushed the report forward that morning, the one who had not asked questions, the one who had let the situation unfold exactly the way it did. And now, for the first time, there were consequences he could not predict. Emily noticed it, not because she was looking for it, but because it was impossible not to. She did not react. She did not acknowledge it. She simply kept working. That, more than anything, shifted the balance. The conference room door opened quietly, and Alexander stepped out, his presence alone enough to draw subtle attention without a single word. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. Conversations dipped just slightly, movements slowed just enough to signal awareness. He walked across the floor with measured steps, not toward Emily this time, but toward the cluster of managers near the glass wall. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, controlled, but it carried in a way that made it clear it was not meant to be ignored. "We are going to review the decision chain from this morning," he said. No raised tone, no visible frustration, just clarity. Daniel straightened immediately, nodding, already preparing an explanation that had likely been forming since the moment everything shifted. "Of course," he replied, but there was a slight delay, just enough to betray the pressure beneath his words. Alexander held his gaze for a moment, not confrontational, but steady, then gave a small nod toward the conference room. "Let us start with who approved the final report without verifying the source corrections," he said. The question was simple, but it did not leave space for deflection. Around them, a few employees subtly adjusted in their seats, their attention drawn despite themselves. This was not how things usually worked. Not this directly. Not this quickly. Back at her desk, Emily paused for just a second, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as the words reached her, not because she was surprised, but because she recognized what was happening. This was not about her anymore. This was the system being pulled into the light. She resumed typing, steady, focused, but this time, there was something different in the way she moved, something quieter, but stronger, like she was no longer working within a structure she had to survive, but one she had chosen to stand in, at least for now. And across the room, as the conversation behind the glass walls began to unfold, the balance of the entire office shifted, not in a moment of disruption, but in a quiet, undeniable correction that had already begun to take hold. The glass walls did not mute the tension inside the conference room. They only made it visible, turning every movement into something the rest of the office could not ignore even if they pretended to. And from where Emily sat, she could see just enough to understand that whatever was happening in there was not routine. Daniel Reeves stood near the far end of the table, a tablet in his hand, his posture rigid in a way that suggested he was no longer speaking with authority, but defending it. Across from him, Alexander remained composed, one hand resting lightly against the back of a chair, not sitting, not settling, as if the conversation itself did not require comfort. The others around the table shifted subtly, their eyes moving between the two men, waiting, measuring, recalculating where they stood now that the ground beneath them had changed. Emily looked back to her screen, but her focus was sharper now, not distracted, but aware, her mind tracking both the numbers in front of her and the shift unfolding across the room. She opened the original report again, the one that had triggered everything, and began reconstructing the sequence step by step, tracing the edits, the timestamps, the approvals. It did not take long to see it clearly. The correction she had made had been removed, quietly, minutes before the report was finalized. Her fingers paused over the keyboard, not in hesitation, but in recognition. This had never been a mistake. It had been a decision. She pulled up the internal log, cross-referenced the entries, and there it was, Daniel Reeves, final approval, no verification. The same name now standing inside that glass room, explaining something that no longer held together. Emily leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to sharpen her focus, then leaned forward again, typing with steady precision, compiling the clean version of the report, every correction documented, every step transparent. No assumptions, no interpretations, just facts. Across the room, the conference door opened briefly, and one of the supervisors stepped out, his expression tight, his usual confidence replaced with something closer to uncertainty. He avoided eye contact with the floor as he moved quickly toward his desk, already pulling up files, already adjusting, as if trying to stay ahead of something that had already caught up. Emily did not look at him directly, but she registered it, the ripple effect moving outward from that room, subtle but undeniable. A moment later, the door opened again, and this time Alexander stepped out, his gaze scanning the floor not in search of someone, but in assessment, taking in the space as it was now, not as it had been earlier. His eyes landed on Emily, and for a brief second, the rest of the office seemed to fall away again. He did not call her over. He did not gesture. He simply walked toward her, his steps measured, deliberate, drawing quiet attention without effort. When he reached her desk, he stopped just to the side, giving her space to remain seated, to remain in control of her work. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice low, but direct. Emily did not look up immediately. She finished the line she was typing, saved the file, then turned the screen slightly toward him. "The correction was removed before final approval," she said, her tone steady, factual. "The log shows who signed off without verifying it." Alexander's gaze moved across the screen, taking in the information, not surprised, but confirming what he had already suspected. He nodded once, then looked back at her. "Send it to me," he said. Emily met his eyes, just for a second. "Already done," she replied. And in that small exchange, something settled into place, not as a victory, not as a resolution, but as alignment, the kind that did not need to be announced to be understood. Across the room, the balance continued to shift, and this time, it was no longer subtle. The moment the email was sent, the shift became irreversible. It did not announce itself with alarms or raised voices, but it moved through the office like a quiet current, unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Screens lit up across the floor as notifications appeared, a forwarded report, Subject line clean, direct, impossible to ignore. Emily did not need to open it again. She already knew every line, every timestamp, every detail that had been buried and was now exposed. Still, she could feel it, the ripple of realization moving desk by desk, person by person, as the information reached people who had not been in the room, who had not witnessed the confrontation, but were now part of its aftermath. Across the floor, Daniel Reeves stepped out of the conference room, his expression no longer controlled, not unprofessional, but tightened in a way that revealed pressure he could not mask anymore. He moved quickly toward his office, not looking at anyone, not acknowledging the quiet attention following him. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow carried more weight than if it had been loud. Emily remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her desk, her posture composed, but her awareness sharpened, tracking the changes without reacting to them. She did not look toward Daniel. She did not need to. The system was responding on its own now. A few desks away, two analysts exchanged a brief glance before turning back to their screens, their movements more careful, more precise, as if the margin for assumption had just disappeared. Near the conference room, one of the supervisors straightened a stack of papers that did not need straightening, his usual casual confidence replaced with quiet focus. It was not fear. It was recalibration. Alexander stood near the center of the floor, his presence steady, not dominating the space, but anchoring it, like the point everything else now moved around. He did not raise his voice. He did not gather attention. Instead, he spoke to the group of managers who had stepped out of the conference room behind him, his tone even, controlled, but carrying a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "We will be restructuring approval protocols effective immediately," he said. "No report will move forward without full verification. No exception." There was a brief pause, not because the instruction was unclear, but because it was absolute. One of the managers nodded quickly, already taking mental notes, already adjusting processes that had been treated as routine just hours ago. Alexander's gaze moved briefly across the floor, not searching, but confirming, and when it landed on Emily again, there was no need for acknowledgement, no visible signal, just a quiet understanding that what had been set in motion was not temporary. Emily felt it, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as something steadier, something that did not demand anything from her except consistency. She reached for her keyboard again, opening the next file, continuing her work without hesitation, because for her, this was never about the confrontation, never about proving a point. It was about doing what was right, whether anyone noticed or not. And now, for the first time, it seemed like that might actually matter. Across the room, conversations resumed, quieter, more deliberate, the rhythm of the office returning, but altered, like a system that had been forced to see itself clearly and could not unsee it. And at the center of it, without announcement, without recognition, Emily Carter continued working, no longer as someone trying to hold her place, but as someone who had just redefined it. By early afternoon, the office no longer felt like the same place Emily had walked into that morning, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because everything subtle had shifted just enough to change how people moved, how they spoke, how they thought before making decisions. The noise level was lower, not quieter in volume, but more intentional, as if every conversation now carried a second layer of awareness beneath it. Emily noticed it in the way emails were written, more precise, fewer assumptions, more questions asked before conclusions were made. She noticed it in the way files were reviewed twice instead of once, in the way people no longer rushed approvals just to move things forward. It was not perfect. It was not fixed, but it was different. She sat at her desk, reviewing a new set of data, her focus steady, her movements efficient, but there was something else there now, something quieter, something grounded, like she was no longer working against the system, but within it on her own terms. A notification appeared on her screen, a calendar request, sender, Alexander Hayes. Her eyes paused on the name for just a second, not surprised, but aware of what it meant. The meeting time was set for 30 minutes from now, location, executive conference room, top floor. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair, exhaling slowly as she processed that. Top floor. That was not a space most employees ever saw, not unless something significant was happening. She accepted the invitation without hesitation, then returned to her work, finishing what she had started before the meeting, not rushing, not overthinking, just maintaining the same consistency that had carried her through everything earlier. Across the office, a few heads lifted as the notification spread through internal channels, not the content, but the location, the awareness that something was happening beyond the usual structure. No one asked her about it. They did not need to. The shift in how they looked at her had already said enough. 30 minutes later, Emily stood in front of the elevator reserved for executive access, the polished steel doors reflecting a version of her that looked the same, but felt different. Her badge unlocked the panel without resistance, a quiet signal that her access had changed without announcement. She stepped inside, the doors closing smoothly behind her, sealing off the noise of the lower floors. As the elevator moved upward, the subtle pressure shift in her ears marked the distance, floor by floor, until the display reached the top. The doors opened into a space that felt almost disconnected from the rest of the building, quieter, more refined, but not in a way that intimidated her. Just different. The hallway was lined with glass walls and muted tones, natural light filtering in from large windows that overlooked the city, the scale of it all stretching out beyond the building. Emily walked forward with steady steps, following the direction indicated in the calendar, her posture relaxed, her expression composed. When she reached the conference room, the door was already slightly open. She paused for just a moment, then stepped inside. Alexander stood near the far end of the room, not behind a desk, not elevated, just standing by the window, looking out over the city below. He turned as she entered, his expression calm, but more open than it had been earlier, less guarded, less distant. "You came," he said, not as a question, but as a simple acknowledgement. Emily nodded once, closing the door behind her. "You asked me to," she replied. There was no tension in her voice now, no edge, just clarity. Alexander studied her for a moment, then gestured lightly toward the chair across from the table, not instructing, just offering. "This is not a performance review," he said. Emily allowed a small, almost unnoticeable shift in her expression, something between curiosity and caution. "Then what is it?" she asked. Alexander held her gaze, and for the first time since this began, there was no layer of testing, no observation behind his words, just direct intent. "It is a decision," he said quietly, "about what happens next for both of us." Emily did not sit immediately, and that hesitation was not uncertainty. It was intention, like she understood. That whatever this conversation was about to become would not be small, would not be something she could step into casually and step out of unchanged. She walked further into the room instead, stopping just across from him, close enough that the distance between them felt deliberate, not imposed. The city stretched behind Alexander in wide glass panels, sunlight reflecting off buildings that looked smaller from this height, distant, almost quiet, and for a brief moment, Emily let herself take it in, not because she was impressed, but because it reminded her how far removed this world was from the one she had come from that morning. Then she looked back at him. "You said this is a decision," she said, her voice steady, grounded, no longer reactive, no longer defensive. "So say it clearly." Alexander did not move to sit either. He remained where he was, his posture relaxed but focused, like he had already considered this moment from every angle and was now choosing how to present it. "What happened today confirmed something I have been trying to identify for a long time," he said. "Not skill, not performance. Those can be trained, improved, replaced. But judgment under pressure, integrity when there is a cost, the ability to act without needing recognition. That is different." Emily held his gaze, listening, but not softened by the words, not persuaded by them alone. "And you think I am the only one who has that?" she asked. Alexander shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "but you are the only one who demonstrated it when it mattered and did not expect anything in return." The room fell quiet again, not empty, but focused, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away. Emily crossed her arms loosely, not closed off, but steady, holding her ground. "So what does that mean?" she asked. Alexander took a small step closer, not closing the distance completely, but narrowing it just enough to make the moment feel more direct. "It means I am offering you something that does not exist in your current role," he said. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, not suspicious, but attentive. Which is, she pressed. Alexander did not hesitate this time. A position working directly with me, he said. Not as an assistant. Not as a subordinate in the traditional sense. As someone who challenges decisions, who questions systems, who sees what others overlook. Because they are too comfortable to notice. Emily did not react immediately. She let the words settle, turning them over in her mind, measuring them not by how they sounded, but by what they implied. You want me to step into your world, she said slowly. Alexander met her gaze without hesitation. I want you to help change it, he replied. The distinction was small, but it mattered. Emily looked away briefly, toward the window, toward the city below, the scale of it, the distance, the weight of what he was asking, then back at him. And what happens when I disagree with you? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. Alexander's expression did not shift. Then you say it, he answered. And I listen. Emily studied him carefully, searching for any sign that this was conditional, that there were limits he was not stating, but she found none, and that absence was more unsettling than any restriction would have been. And if I decide not to take it, she continued. Alexander nodded once, accepting that possibility without resistance. Then you stay exactly where you are, he said, with the same authority you claim today, and the same freedom to walk away if that ever changes. The offer hung in the space between them, not pressured, not urgent, but real. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing just slightly as she absorbed it, not overwhelmed, but aware of the weight of choosing something that could redefine everything that came after. She looked at him one more time, not as the man who had tested her, not as the one who had challenged her, but as someone standing at the same edge of decision she was now facing. And for the first time since this began, the power between them did not feel one-sided. It felt shared. Emily did not rush her answer, and that was the first decision she made, not about the offer, but about how she would approach it, because everything about this moment demanded clarity, not reaction. She took a slow breath, her gaze drifting once more to the city beyond the glass, not to escape the conversation, but to ground herself in something steady, something real, something that existed outside of titles and decisions and expectations. When she looked back at Alexander, her expression had shifted again, not softer, not guarded, but certain. If I say yes, she began, her voice calm and even, it is not because you chose me. Alexander remained still, his attention fully on her, not interrupting, not correcting. It is because I choose to be part of something that is actually willing to change, she continued. And that only works if I am allowed to disagree, even when it is inconvenient. There was no challenge in her tone, no demand, just a clear line drawn with intention. Alexander nodded once, without hesitation. Then that is exactly what you will do, he said. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for any sign of compromise hidden beneath the words, but she found none, and that absence of resistance, of control, settled something in her that had been holding back since the beginning. She exhaled quietly, the decision no longer forming, but complete. Then I will take it, she said. The words were simple, but they carried weight, not because of what they offered, but because of what they required from both of them. For a brief moment, neither of them moved, as if the space itself acknowledged the shift that had just taken place. Then Alexander gave a small nod, not triumphant, not relieved, just acknowledging the choice she had made. Good, he said quietly. There was no extended speech, no formal confirmation, just that one word, grounded and real. Emily allowed a faint, almost unnoticeable breath to escape, not tension leaving, but something else settling, something closer to alignment than uncertainty. She stepped slightly to the side, not retreating, but adjusting, already thinking ahead, already shifting from decision to action. Then we start by fixing what is already broken, she said, her tone steady, practical, unchanged from the way she had spoken on the floor below. Alexander's expression shifted just slightly, something like approval, but without display. We already have, he replied. Emily shook her head once, not dismissive, but precise. No, she said. We exposed it. Fixing it means it does not happen again. The distinction was clear, and this time, Alexander did not respond immediately. He watched her for a moment, then gave a small, deliberate nod. Then we make sure of that, he said. The agreement settled between them without the need for anything more. Outside, The city continued as it always did, indifferent to the decisions made inside glass walls. But inside that room, something had shifted in a way that would not easily return to what it had been. Emily turned toward the door, not to leave the conversation, but to begin what came next, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, not elevated, not transformed, just consistent with who she had been from the beginning. As her hand reached for the handle, she paused for just a fraction of a second, then glanced back over her shoulder, her expression composed, but with a quiet clarity that had not been there before. "I am still replaceable in a system that does not change," she said. Alexander met her gaze, understanding the statement for what it was, not doubt, but a condition. "Then we build one where you are not," he replied. Emily held that for a second, then gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement of what would now have to be proven. She opened the door and stepped out, not into a new role, not into a different version of herself, but into the same path she had chosen. Only now, it stretched further than it had before, and this time, she was not walking it alone. In a world where power decides worth and silence protects the system, one moment changes everything when a young employee refuses to accept being labeled as replaceable. This emotionally driven cinematic narrative follows the clash between a powerful CEO and a principled young woman who refuses to compromise her values even when everything is at stake. As tension builds inside a high-pressure corporate environment, the story unfolds through sharp dialogue, quiet resistance, and a defining moment of integrity that forces the CEO to confront not just her decision, but the broken system he helped build. Unlike typical millionaire stories, this journey is not about wealth or status, but about character under pressure and the cost of standing firm when no one is watching. The narrative explores how a single act of honesty can disrupt an entire hierarchy, revealing the hidden flaws within leadership and the unseen strength of those often overlooked. Through layered emotional storytelling, viewers experience the transformation of both the CEO and the young woman as power shifts from authority to respect and from control to partnership. This is one of those millionaire stories where the real value is not money, but the courage to challenge what is wrong and the willingness to rebuild it. As the story progresses, the CEO begins to see beyond performance metrics and titles, recognizing that true leadership comes from listening, adapting, and choosing integrity over convenience. The young woman, grounded in her reality and driven by responsibility, becomes the unexpected force that reshapes the environment around her, proving that dignity cannot be replaced. This compelling narrative stands out among millionaire stories by focusing on emotional realism, human connection, and the quiet strength of doing what is right without expecting reward. As decisions unfold in glass-walled offices and high-stakes meetings, the story highlights how real change begins not from authority, but from those willing to stand alone. Ultimately, this is more than just another entry in millionaire stories. It is a powerful reminder that leadership is not defined by status, but by action, and that sometimes the one person seen as replaceable is the only one who can truly make a difference. For viewers who are drawn to meaningful millionaire stories with depth, tension, and a satisfying emotional payoff, this narrative delivers a compelling and unforgettable experience. Character 1. 24-year-old white woman, professional office attire, simple blouse and tailored pants, natural makeup, calm, confident expression, front-facing portrait, realistic lighting, cinematic style, high-detail skin texture, modern corporate setting, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Character 2. 35-year-old white male CEO, sharp jawline, composed intense gaze, tailored dark suit, crisp white shirt, confident posture, front-facing portrait, realistic cinematic lighting, high detail skin texture, luxury office background, no cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.